This video is going to address some areas that do not often get discussed. Some of them will seem new to many of you. Many of you will have heard parts of what we have to say. But overall, we're going to cover some areas that the mainstream media have ignored and that have been outside the purview of public debate for the most part. They deal with matters of national security, and the failure to deal with these issues has spanned both Republican and Democratic administrations. They are a byproduct of political correctness, a willful ignorance about the nature of our enemies, and a strategic minimalism that will not see national defense issues in their true context, which is to secure the continued existence of America as a nation from very real threats, which by their very nature may be sovereignty ending. So we would ask that you dispose of many of your preconceived notions about the state of our national security and engage with us about a set of facts that is beyond dispute and an analysis of our current crisis that, if we do not address it, will mean our downfall. We want to highlight some existential vulnerabilities in America's critical infrastructure. But since vulnerability impact is a function of the threats against it, it is worth pointing out that America's national security apparatus currently has a complete lack of strategic comprehension of the nature of the threats facing America. Presently, our national security elites are incapable of identifying America's enemies, their doctrines, and their objectives. The intelligence analytic process is severely broken. Again, these are not things widely discussed, because to discuss them would mean our elected officials have let us down. And no one is going to admit, given the nature of partisan politics, that their party has let you down. No one is going to admit that they misunderstood Islam or that political correctness has permeated the rank and file of our political elites. The Islamic threat notwithstanding, the United States faces two powerful opponents, Russia and China. Few politicians are willing to admit that Russia and China are working against the security interests of the United States. Few politicians are willing to admit that the only reason why Iran and North Korea are emerging nuclear threats to the United States is because Russia and China want them to be. Additional countries are part of the Russian-Chinese alliance, including Cuba, Vietnam, Venezuela, and others. The Congressional Commission to Assess the Threat to the United States from Electro Magnetic Pulse, or EMP, attack revealed that Russian flag officers reported that the nuclear weapons design and deployment refinements necessary to maximize the effectiveness of a high-altitude nuclear EMP attack have been proliferated to rogue nations. Also revealed was Iranian military doctrine, which stated that the preferred use of nuclear weapons against the great Satan, America, would be at a high-altitude nuclear EMP attack, not a kinetic nuclear attack on American cities. Iran has twice launched missiles off of barges in the Caspian Sea and then detonated them at apogee. Media inquiries as to what went wrong were told nothing. These test launches simulated what is a plausible scenario employing existing technology in a high-altitude nuclear EMP attack against the continental United States. With regards to the critical infrastructure vulnerabilities in America, the EMP Commission research revealed that the result of a bad actor employing a well-planned, high-altitude nuclear electromagnetic pulse attack against the United States would be the complete destruction of most of America's critical infrastructure, including the national power grid. Even if the extraordinary resources necessary for reconstitution were available, it would take years to do so. It would not matter, though, because without electricity, modern society could not support itself. In the first year of the aftermath, the U.S. population would dwindle to that size which could be supported without technology, a figure considerably under 100 million. Not to be overlooked in such a scenario, the life and death struggle in America that would take place in the aftermath of such a horrific attack would not be in a vacuum. Enemies of America who initiated such an attack would be at our necks.
EMP is a electromagnetic field, just like when you've probably noticed when you're driving your car or listening to the radio, during a lightning storm, you'll hear a lot of static on the radio. When the lightning strikes, you might hear, something like that. Well, EMP is very similar. The lightning puts out a very strong electric field, and electric field, you can't see it. It's like a force field, and it's measured in volts per meter. A lightning strike, if you're really close to a lightning strike, you might see fields of maybe a few tens of volts per meter. With EMP, which is generated by a high altitude nuclear weapon, you might see tens of thousands of volts per meter. And EMP is caused when you have a nuclear explosion that's up above, maybe it's got to be higher than around 25 miles or 40 kilometers above the Earth. And the gamma rays that come out of a nuclear weapon, of course they come out in all directions, but the gamma rays that stream out down toward the Earth interact with the atmosphere. The atmosphere begins at around 100 kilometers, and around 25 miles, around 40 kilometers, the atmosphere gets thick enough where the gamma rays start to be stopped by the air molecules. And when they're stopped by an air molecule, they will they hit the air molecule and they will ionize the air molecule, which means they strip electrons off the outer shells of the air molecules. And those electrons then start traveling down through the atmosphere in the same direction the gamma rays were moving. And those electrons set up this electric field that I'm talking about. Part of the process is caused by the electrons being turned or turned into a circular path by the presence of the Earth's magnetic field. And when the electrons turn, Maxwell's equations say that they will radiate an electric field, and the electric field is then radiated down in the same direction as the gamma rays. And you get because both the gamma rays and the electric field are traveling at the speed of light, you get an integrative effect. The electric field adds in phase, and you get, actually one way to express it is that the atmosphere below 25 miles becomes a giant phased array antenna. And so you have all of these gamma rays and electrons in the electric field adding and giving you a field at the surface of the Earth that can be tens of thousands of volts per meter. So an electric field, even though you can't see it, if I have I don't know whether I have a pointer, but if I had an antenna that was 1 meter long and it was hit by an electric field of 10,000 volts per meter, I would have a voltage between the tips of the antenna of 10,000 volts. And so you can imagine that when you're listening to your radio in a lightning storm, you just hear a lot of crackle. If you listen to your radio during an EMP, you might hear a pop, and then your radio at 10,000 volts would burn out the integrated circuit front end of your radio, so your radio wouldn't work anymore. So that's one of the big differences. The EMP is so intense in terms of the size of the electric field that it can actually burn out electronics. So that's just basic, just notionally, when we talk about EMP and where does it come from and what does it do, how does it propagate, how does it couple to systems. I think a good way to think about it.
We know that it's real in the sense that in the 1960s, early 1960s, there were tests of nuclear weapons in space, both by the United States and by the Soviet Union. The United States did a series of tests in the Pacific, starting in the summer of 1962, and there's a lot of publicity about starfish. That was the code name for that test series, and it was a scientific test to understand all of the effects of a high altitude burst, one of which was EMP. And measurements were made. Some systems of 1962 vintage, including streetlights, were turned off. There was some limited damage to electronics, but the only place that there was an effect was on the island of Oahu, which was 1,400 kilometers away from the burst. Underneath the burst, there was no land, just ocean. However, when the Soviets did their testing, they tested over Kazakhstan. And we learned much later, not in the 60s, but we learned in 1994, when they went to a conference and told us of many, many effects where they lost telephone communications, they lost some of their power, they had many effects which we did not know about. And for that reason, we now understand why the Soviets and now the Russians take EMP a lot more seriously than we do. Mm-hmm. So there is evidence, it is important, and one thing that's different is our modern electronics is much more sensitive. And the reason we know that, it's not just hypothetical. We studied the data that we took in the 1960s of what the electromagnetic fields looked like. We built simulators to produce those fields. And now we can test any electronics, including the most modern. And we know that the modern electronics is much more sensitive, mainly because it's digital and it operates internally at very low voltages, 3 volts or 1.8 volts on the chip. And when you have 50,000 volts per meter approaching a piece of electronics like a laptop that's operating at 1.8 volts inside, it's just a matter of how much energy really gets inside the shielded container. And the main way, of course, such a high altitude nuclear weapon would be delivered is on a missile. I mean, it's very difficult to do it in any other way. That being said, I think there was a James Bond movie in which a device was actually in the satellite, but if the satellite were too high, the effect would be minimal on the Earth's surface because distance is a factor. But anyway, it does take missile technology. Unfortunately, as we know, missile technology is spreading throughout the world. Many countries are developing advanced missiles and they are selling them to people who can't develop them. So missile technology has proliferated. And then you have the question of the nuclear devices. There are only so many declared countries that have the capability to build nuclear weapons, but again, it seems from the newspapers that this capability is expanding, and there's always the danger of countries acquiring a nuclear weapon that don't build them themselves, and so this is an additional concern. In the end, at least today, only a few countries, the U.S., Russia, China, France, and England, have the ability to deliver long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles with enough throw weight to have a nuclear weapon on top. Mm-hmm. One would not